Hey, good morning, Murray Hills. Good morning to those of you in Columbia right now. Good morning to those of you in Spring Hill right now. Really glad to have you with us today, and I hope it's been an awesome Sunday. I hope you've had an incredible time of worship. I hope you've had a great time of communion together. As you've probably guessed, I'm not with either one of you right now. I had planned to be with Spring Hill today. That was on the schedule, but travel plans changed because we've got a little family vacation in New York City. So in all likelihood, right now, I am somewhere in New York, and some New Yorker is incredulously asking me, where are you from? Because apparently I have a tiny little bit of a Southern accent, just a little bit of a Southern accent. The last time we were in a big northern city, we went to dinner. It was just Jenny and I at dinner, and the waitress hadn't even taken our drink order yet. So she comes up to the table and says, hello. And I say, hello. And she says, where are you from? And it's like, seriously? Is it that obvious? I mean, I have that much of a Southern accent that I can only say one word and you know I'm from the South. And she said, yeah, that's exactly right. And Jenny's nodding her head too, because it embarrasses my girls to death when we go to a big city like this. So the girls are right now probably trying to get me to talk quieter in the subway or to talk quieter in the taxi or on the crowded streets, which of course just makes me want to talk all the louder in the biggest Southern accent. Hey, y'all want to go up here and get a hot dog somewhere in the street or something? So I'm embarrassed. Y'all pray for my family. I'm embarrassing my family right now somewhere in New York City, but I couldn't be with you today, and I didn't want to hand this off to a guest speaker. And I'll tell you why. This is the last Sunday in the Prodigal God series, and this has been a really good study. I've enjoyed studying this story again and kind of being reminded of the things that Jesus taught us in there, and I wanted to close it out. And so when I knew I wasn't going to be able to be here to close it out, I wanted to do it via video. So if you got a Bible with you, Luke 15 is where we're going to be. If you got a Bible app on your phone, you can go find Luke 15, and I'm calling this last message the Feast of the Father. Because what we're going to look at today is the party that the father throws for the younger son. You know, the one that the older brother refused to enter. And I think you might even argue that the party is the point of the story. I mean, you remember why Jesus told the story in the first place, right? I hope so, because I've mentioned it every single week of the series. He told the story to confront the religious people of his day. It was a kind of a prideful, self-righteous attitude in the Pharisees, and he was trying to confront that attitude with this story. Because what they were doing is, that the NIV actually says, they were muttering, he welcomes and eats with sinners. Now, I looked up that word muttering in the dictionary, and it says that to mutter means to say something in a low voice, especially in dissatisfaction or irritation. Now, that's not exactly the Greek. I looked up the Greek word that's translated mutter, and it just means to indignantly complain in a group. So the Pharisees, they weren't necessarily saying it in a low voice. They were saying it loud enough for Jesus to hear, and they were complaining about the kind of people Jesus was hanging out with. And so Jesus said, let me tell you a story. And he tells them three stories. He tells them the story of the man who lost a sheep, the woman who lost a coin, and then the man who lost not one son, but two sons. And a common theme among all three stories is each story includes a celebration. If you look at chapter 15, I want to read just a couple of verses together with you. In that first story, the man who lost a sheep, it says in verse 5, when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep. And Jesus explains, I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. And then the story of the woman who lost a coin, Jesus says when she finds it, she calls all her friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I found my lost coin. And in the same way, I tell you, there is more rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. And in the story of the man who lost two sons, in response to losing the younger son, when he comes home, the man says to him in verse 22, says to his servants, bring the best robe and put it on him and put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet and bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found. So they begin to celebrate. But my favorite description of all the celebrations that Jesus used is the one that the Father gives to the older son, the one who refused to come in the party. Down in verse 32, he explains to that son, we had to celebrate and be glad. We had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now he's found. Now, Jesus is trying to teach us something very specific in these stories. He's trying to teach us something about the character and nature of our God, which means he's also trying to teach us something about the character and nature of God's children. But let's get practical for a minute. A little exercise, if you will. I want you to rate something for me. If you were to rate the following on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not joyful at all, a total grump and a cynic and bitter and angry and resentful, and 10 being just exuberantly joyful. I mean, celebratory, rejoicing, jumping up and down. I mean, so 1 is not joyful at all, 10 is over the top joyful. How would you rate the following? Religion. When you hear that word religion, do you think that's a 1 or a 10? Or where does it fall? Church, God, or God's people, religious people. The phrase religion, when you think of religious people, do you think of someone who's just over the top joyful? Do you think of people that are just so kind and so encouraging to be around, people who are so positive? Do you think of people, when you hear the word Christian people or church people or religious people, do you think of people who are so full of love and so life-giving that people just want to spend more time with them? My guess is you don't. Especially if we put that word religion in there, it makes it sound even worse. And what's worse than that is a lot of us don't think of God in that way either. We have a hard time thinking, this God that Jesus describes in Luke 15, that doesn't sound like God to us. A celebratory figure, a God who rejoices over things, a God who throws a party and celebrates. The way I grew up in church, we weren't taught to think of God in that way, as this joyful, smiling, exuberant God. We were taught to approach God with solemnity and seriousness. You know, when you come to church and you approach God, you do so with reverence and respect and with quietness and stillness. And there's a place for that. I get that. There's a place for reverence for God. But there's also a place for celebration for God. Because the very point of all 3 stories is that when that which is lost is found, that's worthy of celebration. And the one leading the celebration is our God. He's the one who rejoices. Nouwen writes in his book that God rejoices not because all the problems of the world are solved, not because all human pain and suffering have come to an end, not because thousands of people have been converted and are now praising him for his goodness, but God rejoices, as Jesus explains, God rejoices because one of his children has been lost and is now found. Just one of his children is lost and now found. And Jesus is using these stories to invite the Pharisees into that joy. The first 3 weeks of this series, I've couched the story in terms of confrontation. Jesus is using the parable of the prodigal son to confront the Pharisees and their attitudes. And he is. But could it also be that he's not just confronting their attitude, but he's inviting them into the joy of the Father. He's saying to them, you guys are muttering and complaining about the people I'm hanging around. I want to invite you into that same kind of joy, because these people who are lost are being found. These people who are dead are alive again. And I'm inviting you into the celebration. I'm inviting you to join the party. And it's the same thing Jesus invites us into today. Jesus is inviting us to join the Father's celebration. And that all sounds great to me in theory. The problem is this. Make a confession to you. I'm not a very expressive guy. Like when it comes to, even if I'm thrilled about something, like if you give me a Christmas present and I'm completely and totally thrilled, I'm so excited to receive this present, I'm probably not going to react that way emotionally. it's just not me. You know, some people are just kind of wired to be more emotionally expressive. That is not me. Now, that's not much of a secret. Those of you that have known me for any length of time know that I kind of keep my emotions in check and I'm fairly reserved and those kinds of things. It's just, that's my personality. At least I think that's part of it. Part of it is, that's the way I was raised. My family of origin, Adcoxes are not huggers. Okay, we're not kind of the real expressive people that are going to jump up and down, and that's kind of who we are. All right, and then part of it is just the way I grew up. I grew up in a denomination that was pretty conservative. I mean, our worship was not anything near charismatic. I mean, if somebody raised a hand in our worship, you thought they were asking a question. So, I mean, it would have stopped. For somebody to raise a hand in the church I grew up in, it would have stopped the service. Which, do you need something? I'm sorry, what's going on? I mean, it's just, so all of those things combined are reasons that I don't really celebrate as much as I should. You know, it's my personality. I'm just not that's not the kind of guy I am, or it's the kind of church I was raised in. That's just not what we were taught to do, or, you know, that's my family. It's not what Adcoxes do. But honestly, that's not completely true. If the situation is right, even I know how to celebrate. I'll give you an example. You guys know that I coach softball at Zion Christian Academy, have for the last 6 years. And last year, we had this incredible run in the tourney. We ended up winning the district last year. We were the 4 seed going into it. So we weren't supposed to be in the championship game at all. But lo and behold, 3 days into the district tournament, we found ourselves in the championship game of the tournament. And my daughter is pitching, and she's throwing a shutout. And it's 1-0. Zion's on top with 1 run. We get to the last inning. Of course, Lily's getting tired by this point. She didn't throw many shutouts, and I'm wondering, can she hang on for the victory? And so all those nerves are kind of going. Ezel Harding is who we're playing. Ezel Harding gets 2 kids on base, and we get 2 outs. So the last batter Lily faces is the 4 or 5 hitter, right in the heart of their order. They got the winning run on base. All we need is 1 more out. I mean, the tension is just as high as you can possibly be. I am pacing in the dugout. Like Coach Fox is saying, would you sit down so I can call pitches? Because I'm just walking back and forth in the dugout because I'm just so on edge. Are we going to pull it out? Are we going to pull it out? The girl gets up. Lily throws her the pitch. She hits a towering shot to left field. I mean, a towering shot. It is and like we're going back, go back, go back. Peyton White's playing in left field. Peyton's a freshman. She's playing out there in left field, and Peyton's scrambling to get back underneath that ball, and the ball's going up in the air, and the girls on the bases are rounding. Like the winning run has already scored. If Peyton drops this ball game. And Peyton gets up underneath that ball and gets right at her, and she sticks her glove out and catches it. And I am leaping off of my feet in the dugout. We go pouring out, because that's ball game. When Peyton gets that last out, we go pouring out of that dugout, and we're running on the field, and we're celebrating together, and I run up to Peyton, and I give her this big, huge bear hug. I'm like, thank you, Peyton. That was so awesome. I'm just celebrating with her. And later, her dad tells me after the ball game, he says, you so shocked my daughter. And I said, what? And he said, on the way home, she told me, Dad, I've known Russ for 15 years. He's never hugged me until tonight. and the sad thing is, I'm laughing about it because it's not in my nature to be a hugger and a celebrator, but Peyton picked up on that. The sad thing is, I was at her baptism a few years earlier, and I didn't react that way at her baptism. I reacted that way because she caught a ball that somebody hit off of a bat. And I'm just trying to make the point that if the situation is right, even I know how to celebrate. And what better situation than someone who is lost coming home to Jesus? What better situation to celebrate? What better situation for the church to celebrate than a baptism? What better situation for the church to celebrate than a worship service on a Sunday morning when we're thanking God for what He's done for us? What better situation to celebrate when one of our friends shows up who hadn't been at church in years, who's been running away from God for years, and one of them, they show up to our church one Sunday morning, or they show up to our small group. What better situation to celebrate? And we have that opportunity. We get to choose whether or not we're going to be the critic or the celebrant. I mean, that's the choice we get to make every Sunday when we gather together with God's people. Every time we gather together with our small groups, or every time we go serve in children's ministry, or whatever we're doing, we get to choose whether we're going to be positive or negative, whether we're going to be celebrating or complaining, whether we're going to create a place of joy and exuberance, or whether we're going to create a place of cynicism and negativity. This is the thing that Henry Nouwen talks about in his book. And I haven't talked a lot about this book. I've talked more about Tim Keller's book, The Prodigal God. But Nouwen's book is equally as powerful. And as Nouwen kind of steps through, he talks about how he used to relate to the younger son. And then he related to the older son. And then he starts talking about the feast of the Father. And he said the feast of the Father is telling us, all of us, that we have a choice. We get to make a choice every day as to whether or not we'll participate in the celebration of our Savior. And here's the way he puts it. I just read a little quote to you here, a paragraph. He says, it's amazing for me to experience daily the radical difference between cynicism and joy. Cynics seek darkness wherever they go. They always point to approaching dangers, impure motives, hidden schemes. They call trust naive and care romantic and forgiveness sentimental. They sneer at enthusiasm. They ridicule spiritual fervor. They despise charismatic behavior. They consider themselves the realist, who see reality for what it is and are not deceived by all these emotions. But in belittling God's joy, their darkness only calls forth more darkness. People who have come to know the joy of God do not deny the darkness, but they choose not to live in it. They claim that the light that shines in the darkness can be trusted more than the darkness itself, and that little bit of light can dispel a lot of darkness. And they point each other to flashes of light here and there, and they remind each other that they reveal the hidden but real presence of God. And now it says that's the choice that you and I get to make. We get to determine whether or not we're going to reveal the hidden. I know the world's a tough place to live in. I know we get down and we get depressed and we get angry and we get bitter. It's easy to get cynical today. But we get to choose as to whether or not we reveal the real presence of God. God is not cynical. That's not a characteristic of our God. Nowhere in Scripture do you hear about God being cynical. So why should His people be cynical? What you hear instead are stories of God rejoicing, stories of God celebrating, stories of God throwing big feasts and banquets and inviting everyone to be a part of it. And that's what He's inviting us into. And that's the choice we have at the end of the story. The choice we have is the same choice as the elder brother. The elder brother could decide whether or not he was going to continue to sit in his anger or whether he was going to swallow his pride and go into the party and celebrate with the Father. In some ways, I even think the choice that we have is the same choice as the younger brother. The younger brother had to decide whether or not he was going to continue to sit in his self-pity and his sorrow and feel bad for himself, or whether he was going to get up and go home to his Father. And that's the choice we have. That's the choice we get to make. Nouwen says it beautifully at the end of his book. He says, you know how we all relate to one or the other? You know, we relate to the younger son or we relate to the older son. And I've said that throughout this series. You know, some of you are younger brother Christians and you're like, boy, I can relate. I ran away from God for a long time and I went off and wasted all my opportunities and now I'm home and God's, well, you relate to that younger brother. Some of you relate to the older brother. Man, I've been prideful and self-righteous and I've been sanctimonious and thought that my obedience bought me something and now I'm starting to understand that that's not what I'm supposed to be. We relate differently to these two brothers. But what Nouwen says is that the shocking conclusion of the story is we're not to be like either brother. God is asking us to become like the Father in the story, To not just be the one that is welcomed home, but to be the one that welcomes other people home. To not just be the one that is given compassion, but to be the one that gives compassion to others. To not just be the one that's forgiven, but to be the one that offers forgiveness to others. To not just be the one that is receiving joy, but to be the one who gives joy to others. That's what Jesus is calling us to be like the Father. Luke chapter 6, verse 36, he says, be merciful as my Father is merciful. In other places in the gospel, he says, forgive as my Father has forgiven you. That's ultimately what Jesus is calling us to be. He's calling us to grow up. Grow up out of your younger brother's sins. Grow up out of your elder brother pride, and become like the compassionate and loving Father. So that's the challenge I'll issue us. As we wrap up this message and wrap up this series, we're called to become like our Father. And it's a big challenge, and it's not easy. And we've got an enemy that's fighting us all the time. And we've got an inner, kind of selfish, indulgent attitude that's fighting us all the time. We got some pride that's fighting us all the time. But what I'd like to do to close this series is I want to invite Tim and Ebony back up on stage right now. And I want to ask each of them to pray over these two campuses and just pray that we would do away with our younger brother sins and do away with our older brother attitudes, and that we would start to become joyful and compassionate and loving like our Father. So, hey, good morning, Murray Hills.
You don't have to